Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, how do we produce knowledge?
I suppose through observation. Something cannot be created out of nothing, so we must simply look with eyes unclouded to see what is already there.
What does the Buddha do?
I believe he teaches us how to purify our senses and what we are to see if we did so.
Don't all the ascetics and gurus do that?
Yes, every one of them.
I wonder what makes the Buddha so different.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing the relationship between Buddhism and Western science. How are they related? Do they assert the same things? Does one validate or reinforce the other? We hope you enjoy.
So let's begin. What is the relationship between Buddhism and science?
This is a question that has kind of a long history, so let's get started. In Europe, starting in the early half of the 19th century, several important things were starting to happen. First among them is the Industrial Revolution. 100 or so years of Enlightenment-era thought based on rationality, reason, logic, and science as the sole means of knowledge production culminated in a massive leap forward technologically and economically. This time period and Enlightenment era is the origin of the science and religion debate in the West. Scientists, philosophers, and theologians in Europe began to ask, what is the most reliable and useful means of production of knowledge? How can we come to understand reality? What is truth? Etc. Scientists, philosophers, and theologians all had different answers for these types of questions. But in short, this is when science began to define itself against religion and vice versa. Religion stuck to unanswerable questions that science could not really approach or deal with through experimental or observational means. Science then stuck to answerable questions, which could be dealt with through observation and experimentation. Religion was about faith, and science was about evidence. Religion emphasized knowledge through religious revelation and study of scripture, and science emphasized knowledge through experimentation, objectivity, verifiability, etc. I need to emphasize here that these are Western understandings of science and religion, and they do not hold up in East Asia. But we will talk about that in a moment. I should also note that how you and I view religion today is a direct result of that debate, and the need for science and religion to define themselves against each other in that time period. Furthermore, European nations were going overseas to colonize distant lands and take their resources. That is the second important development of this time period. That time is when they came into contact with Buddhism in East Asia. I don't have to repeat that there have been many translation issues that have adversely affected our understanding of Buddhism in the West, but suffice to say that when Buddhist texts were translated into Western languages, scientists and philosophers hopped on it because they misunderstood it to be an East Asian version of what they were already doing in Europe. They thought that it was all about understanding the nature of reality through analysis and observation, and through cultivating rationality, reason, logic, and morality that was based on something other than the Bible. So scientists and philosophers who are already perhaps dubious and wary of Christianity hopped on it because their relationships with the Christian church had been crumbling for at least 2 or 3 centuries by this point. Therefore, Buddhism became a close friend of a lot of Western scientists and scholars.
Do science and Buddhism actually believe the same things?
Before I answer, I should say that when we say science, we mean the body of knowledge that has been produced through the means of scientific method. This means the body of all information in the world that we would not have if we did not perform an experiment to produce it. The short answer then is no. There are vitally important disagreements between Buddhism and science. First of all, Buddhism is not just one thing. There are tons of schools of Buddhism who all have very different perspectives on some of the fundamental things that we have gone over. Second, the way that Buddhism functions in the daily life of the typical person in East Asia is completely and totally different from the way that science functions. In my view, they are addressing separate human needs by separate means. What I mean by that is that science provides a way of categorizing and making sense of daily lived experienced life. And Buddhism provides a community, a sense of social belonging, and spiritual fulfillment and contentment for people. These two things are not always mutually exclusive, but in most cases, I believe that they are, in practice at least. So, in my view, because they are addressing separate human needs by separate means, there are moments when our misunderstandings of science and Buddhism resonate with each other. This is where these moments of mutual exclusivity kind of crumble. For example, when we learn about emptiness in English, the very word emptiness immediately comes to mind when we learn that atoms are mostly empty space between nuclei and electrons. This is something we've discovered through experimental means, and it's something that might resonate with what you think emptiness is in Buddhism. But that's a complete misunderstanding of what emptiness means in Buddhism. We might be quick to conflate the two assertions as the same observable fact discovered by scientists in the modern era and Buddhists in the pre-modern era, but it's not that at all. Buddhism and Buddhist emptiness is not about actual observable empty space. As we've talked about before, it's about impermanence. It refers to the absence of permanence and not to the absence of stuff. That's what emptiness in English might refer to, is the absence of something being there. An empty cup has nothing in it. That doesn't really resonate with impermanence in our colloquial language that much, but in Buddhism it does. So, given that it refers to the absence of permanence and not the absence of stuff, these two are mutually exclusive concepts. Secondly, science emptiness is simply related to the size of subatomic particles and the nuclear forces that attract them. Again, having nothing to do with impermanence. Nuclei of atoms and electrons are extremely small, and nuclear forces would need massive, incalculable amounts of energy to hold nuclei and electrons together any closer than they are already held together. This is but one example of how dangerous translation is for Buddhist doctrine, and how it is received and understood in the West. It's also an example of how critically important words are in understanding disparate ideas. Words have different meanings in different contexts, and that cannot be forgotten when understanding the relationship between Buddhism and science, or when studying religion in general.
So there's a lot to go over in that answer, but one thing I want to emphasize, you said in here, Buddhism is not just one thing. Neither is science. There are a lot of scientists who go about things in different ways, who believe different things. Just as Buddhism is not a monolith, neither is science.
That's absolutely true.
I would say that science and Buddhism, and I would also extend this to religion in general, are different tool sets that can both augment and cancel out each other. So, for example, the idea of emptiness, talking about the idea of emptiness in science helps one sometimes understand the idea of emptiness within Buddhism. So the idea of being able to point out that, like, hey, atoms are mostly a small nucleus, empty space, an electron cloud. Like, that idea of emptiness is everywhere can be kind of helpful in understanding the idea of emptiness in Buddhism. I guess it's partially a problem of translation, because what Buddhist concept of emptiness is not really what the word empty means in English. Like, do they use the same word for Buddhist emptiness as they do for an empty cup?
That's a good question. I think that in Japanese, which is what I'm the most familiar with, emptiness refers to the same character, the same kanji, which I will include in the show notes, that you can use to refer to the sky, or to something that looks like it's there, but is actually something you can't touch, something that's empty space, right? The sky is blue, it has color, it has form. We see it change every day. So we think, okay, there must be something there. If I go high enough, I can touch it. But actually you can't. When it comes to an empty cup, it is kind of a different word that you would use. So the word for Buddhist emptiness that you might use frequently is ku, and the word for an empty cup, it'd be kind of like a phrase. You would say like the cup without anything in it, the cup without water in it, the cup without stuff in it. It's an actually different word, actual different phrase to describe those two things.
That might be a bit of why we in the West have these misconceptions about mingling science and Buddhism, is because of spots where the words are just different.
Absolutely.
And can't be completely translated into English.
I agree completely. And I also think that translation is necessarily, always, every time, interpretation. And this is especially true the farther in linguistic relationship two languages are. So if you're translating from German to English, you're not really taking as many liberties as often as you would be translating Japanese to English or Sanskrit to English.
Those languages are further apart.
Exactly. And not only that, cultural and affective distance makes a difference as well, right? So if you're translating texts that are coming from a predominantly Christian culture into a culture which is predominantly Christian, then you're not taking as many liberties there either. If you're translating texts from a predominantly Buddhist culture into one that is predominantly Christian, or a pre-modern culture into one that's modern, in both cases, you're taking a great deal of liberty in trying to communicate the meaning of the text. And that's what translation is trying to come to an understanding of the meaning of a text and then communicate that meaning in a different language entirely. And all the time, without fail, that's going to be informed by the culture and the ideology and the upbringing, the values of society at the time of the translation. And that's why we see a lot of these scholarly translations into English in the early modern era of Buddhist texts that were kind of casting it off as something that Christianity was not, as everything Christianity couldn't be, as everything that Judeo-Christian religions in general, Judaism and Islam included, couldn't be. It's something that's based on analysis and is not based on blind faith, is not based on trying to come to an understanding of truth through reading the Bible or being saved or anything like that. It's something that they wanted to see in a religion because they didn't, even though they were scientists, scholars, even though many of them were materialists and thought there was nothing there but what could be sensed by the five senses, even then they still wanted there to be something that's spiritually fulfilling about being alive, something spiritually fulfilling about existence. And Buddhism provided that because that's where they were looking for it, is in Buddhism. Buddhism provided that because they read that into it in its own way. And that's not to say that Buddhism is not spiritually fulfilling. That's not to say that Buddhism is not a means of coming to understand reality in some sort of way. But it's, as we've said, different tool sets and oftentimes different problems to use those tools for. And I think that this co-opting of Buddhism is the source of this new agey, self-helpy type of Buddhism that we talk about so often on this podcast. They've taken it up because they're selling it to people who are perhaps suspicious of Christianity, suspicious of some of the teachings of Christianity, and they want to sell it as a religion that's not a religion. And you can't really do that. Buddhism is, in fact, a religion. There's rituals, there's doctrines, there's rules, there's morality, there's universes, even if you look hard enough, there's an origin to the universe and an end to the universe. It's got all of the necessary pieces. And so it's just how it's presented and how people are reading into it that makes the difference here.
Keeping to that idea of no religion being incompatible with science, that is a true thing, and the reason is because they are both tool sets. And at the end of the day, you don't use a screwdriver when you need a hammer. So exactly. In the same way, you wouldn't use science when you need religion, or you wouldn't use religion when you need science. Early on in my own science/engineering training, a very important idea was given to me, and that was the idea of falsifiability. If a claim cannot be falsified, as in said, this is false, then science is not the correct tool for that question. And so just going to the idea of, does God exist? Well, there's never going to be a means of measuring that's ever going to convince religious people. And it's also not really going to give any evidence against that claim, because that claim can be true regardless of what we see.
Exactly.
That claim is unfalsifiable and therefore not the domain of science.
I agree completely, and I always got the exact same training in my own science background. For those of you that may not know, I was a biologist in my undergrad, and we got the exact same thing. If you can't falsify a claim, if you can't repeat experimental results, if it's not an objective basis of truth and rather a subjective basis of truth, then it's not within the domain of science. It's not within the domain of experimentation or observation. And we've talked a lot about why science co-opting Buddhism for validation and for reinforcement is problematic for Buddhism. But this is where it poses a problem for science itself.
Mm-hmm.
Science borrowing religion for its own validity makes sense if you think of it in terms of the conflict between science and religion that's been going on in the West for 400 years. But it's definitely a big mistake, a big time overreach for science as a body of knowledge, because they're reaching into the unverifiable, the unfalsifiable, to reinforce the verifiable and falsifiable. And that's, you can't have your feet in both camps. But in that intersection, that is where a lot of misunderstanding of science and religion comes up. That is where a lot of misunderstanding of the relationship between truth and falsifiability comes up. I think that's a much more concerning problem than presenting Buddhism as though there are no rituals, there's no faith-based anything, there's no exegesis, meaning no philosophy of salvation. I think that's much more dangerous, is thinking that science can still work if it pulls bodies of interpretation from religion and from places that don't really function well on falsifiability and sensible, tangible evidence and things like that.
And we can find all kinds of examples of where science and religion mixing in that way has produced bad science.
And bad religion.
And bad religion. And it's hard to say which of those two is more destructive in the end.
It really is, yeah. And I think that ultimately, I'm more okay with, if I had to pick my evils, my poisons, I'm more okay with the erasure of, ritual and exegesis and esotericism from Buddhism to make a living philosophy for Westerners than I am for the erasure and misunderstanding of experimentation and knowledge by means of falsifiability in science. What I mean by that is New Age Buddhism may be problematic in that it overlooks important points and it erases important things in Buddhism's history and doctrine, but it's not hurting anybody. Bad science has the potential to hurt a lot of people.
A lot of people. And
we don't want to fall into that trap. So in the end, sure, it's fine that Buddhism, as we understand it today, is kind of self-helpy, kind of what we might call in the West spirituality nowadays. But that's fine. But science being misunderstood and misapplied and misused according to doctrines of religion is very bad.
Does science validate or reinforce Buddhism, or vice versa?
Yeah, I included this question because even though I think that I've already answered it pretty conclusively that they do not, there are many people out there that think that they do, both Buddhists and scientists. There are scientists everywhere who are hoping to get a leg up on the science versus religion battle by finding validation and credibility in Buddhism. This goes on even to the point where a great deal of cognitive and neurological research is being carried out on Buddhist meditation. That's something that we talked a little bit about in the last episode discussing therapy meditation versus Buddhist meditation. I should mention now that this activity is ideologically charged. This is part of an agenda on the part of Western science to become the singular paragon of knowledge production and understanding of truth, and to win out as the superior means of understanding the nature of reality over Western religions. I personally am on the side of science, and I always have been, but we must all understand that it is a human activity, and so it's fallible, meaning science is a human activity and can be fallible. It can be subject to bias, and it can be subject to agenda. Somebody who sets out to prove a thing will set up their experiments and their data to prove a thing, be it consciously or unconsciously. That is a misuse of science, a misunderstanding of science, but it can happen.
And does happen frequently.
Very much so. I believe that a lot of this cognitive and neurological research that misunderstands Buddhist meditation studies it and sets it up so that they're going to prove that something good happens through what they are misunderstanding to be Buddhist meditation. So they're taking their own bad interpretation of something, and they are doing experiments such that their own bad interpretation will be reinforced. This is actually one of the more harmless examples of this happening in science. We won't get into the other ones, but this is actually, as you can see, a heinous misuse of science.
And it only gets worse from there.
It only gets worse from there. Additionally, there are Buddhists out there who love the credibility and validation that science is giving them. This is actually something that I have a problem with concerning the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibetan Buddhism. He, for good reason, really, really encourages a close relationship between Tibetan Buddhism and science. He has good reason because Tibetan Buddhism has been under threat from the rest of China for about a millennium, and even more so in the last century between Tibet and the Chinese Communist Party. And so in order to keep his philosophy, his Buddhism alive, it's very good that he wants to align himself with the West and the strength that science brings to bear on these things. However, there is a lot of problematic and complicated misunderstanding of science and Buddhism going on there. Not to say that the Dalai Lama is misunderstanding Buddhism, but he is presenting it in such a way that perhaps it gains popularity with those who believe in science and decided they don't believe in religion. Lots of Buddhists, other than the Dalai Lama as well, look to scientists and they say, yeah, we figured out that stuff 2,500 years ago. Emptiness is a good example of that. All of this research about meditation and the neuroscience behind it is another example. However, I should say they didn't. The Buddhists did not figure that out 2,500 years ago. But the relationship gives them social power and credibility that no other religion has. Very few other religions, if any, can have science as a claim to fame. I certainly don't think that Judeo-Christian religions can look to science and say they are proving the things that you might see in the Bible or the Quran or the Talmud or the Torah. So some Buddhists try to replicate and reinforce this relationship by erasing mythology, ritual, and whatever else might be thought of as irrational doctrines. So now, Buddhism is seen as a philosophy instead of a religion in the West, and it is perceived as something that you can believe in even if you're a member of another religion. This philosophy of inclusivity is the major selling point of Buddhism in the West for a lot of people who are disenfranchised with the doctrine of exclusivity that you find in Judeo-Christian religions. The other side of this is that you can believe in Buddhism and believe in science, and you might often think that those two reinforce each other. However, that is actually a very, very young relationship. This is something that I'm here to argue has only existed since the 1830s, and it's very ideologically charged, and it's very set up between East-West power relationships and between colonialism and an imperial past, and through a centralization and misunderstanding of both science and Buddhism.
I do think that science should study Buddhist meditation, but only for the same reason that science should also study Christian prayer, or Islamic prayer, or any other sort of religious ritual to understand what that does to the human brain. But as we already talked about, and we don't have to go over this again because it's in the meditation episode, they're still doing different things at the end of the day. And I would say I've read a bit of the 14th Dalai Lama's comments on science. The interpretation I get from there is that he is aware that science and religion aren't tackling the same problems. The actual quote was something along the lines of, this is a paraphrase, I don't remember exactly, but it was something along the lines of, if science conclusively proves that something is contrary to Buddhist doctrine, then we should abandon that doctrine or something like that. And I think he is confident enough to say that because he knows that falsifiability issue, like science and Buddhism aren't tackling the same problems. So it's not something that science is likely to plow over any more than it is likely to plow over the existence of the Christian God.
Exactly. And this is something that I should mention as well. I don't want listeners to think that I am out on a crusade against the Dalai Lama for his statements regarding science. But I do want to mention that I think that he is also aware, and we should also be aware of the fact that this falsifiability issue has come up in the relationship between Buddhism and science for quite a while. In the pre-modern era, Buddhism believed that the geography of the world was 4 countries surrounding a giant mountain called Mount Sumeru. And as soon as Western colonizers showed up and their sheer presence shattered that illusion, that doctrine had to be redrawn. They had to say, oh wait, the world actually looks different than we have been saying it does for several centuries. And there were those who were resistant to that change and were saying that, no, this is just sabotage and imperialism from the West. And there were those who supported that change, saying falsifiability is an important component of credibility. And ultimately, the latter party won out. And now there are very few Buddhists, if any Buddhists out there, who think that the earth looks like 4 countries surrounding a giant mountain. I should also mention that this mountain is nowhere to be found, and it has been nowhere to be found. It's semi-mythical, Mount Sumeru. The only reason they thought that's the way the world was arranged is actually because that came up in sutras. Mount Sumeru is this mythical mountain that's taller than even Mount Everest and is often used for metaphor and simile and hyperbole. Anyways, that was the first, or I guess maybe the earliest documented time where Buddhists were confronted with falsifiability. They were confronted with the fact that they had made a claim that was not falsifiable, or that they thought was, but then was falsified. And they had to make an adaptation. And this is something that's happened in East Asian Buddhism for hundreds of years since that happened. And the Dalai Lama is not alone in making his statement that if science disproves Buddhism, then we need to change Buddhism and not change science and not disagree with science. We hope you enjoyed our discussion of the relationship between Buddhism and science. Join us next week where we will do an in-depth discussion of one of the major schools of East Asian Buddhism, the Heavenly Vehicle School, known as Tiantai in Chinese or Tendai in Japanese. What is Tendai? How is it different from other schools of Buddhism? How does it influence other schools of Buddhism? Thank you. We'll see you next time.
See you then.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.